Northern and central Mexico experienced a series of extreme weather events that disrupted the lives of thousands of residents. Three major cities, Piedras Negras in the state of Coahuila, Monterrey in Nuevo León, and Guadalajara in Jalisco, captured national attention after being struck by strong winds, torrential rains, and widespread flooding. These events not only reflected the unpredictable power of nature, but also exposed the systemic vulnerabilities that still plague Mexico's major cities. Piedras Negras, a border town rocked by thunderstorms. On the evening of September 7th, the skies over Piedras Negras transformed into an atmospheric battlefield. Intense thunderstorms battered the border city, bringing hail and gusty winds reaching 20 kilometers per hour. Rainfall reached 6.48 millimeters in 1 hour at its peak, enough to cause flooding on main streets and narrow alleys. Several districts experienced power outages due to lightning strikes and damage to distribution networks. Schools were temporarily closed, and economic activity was disrupted. Residents living in low-lying areas were forced to evacuate to higher ground, even though no official evacuation centers were open. Local authorities issued early warnings, but limited communications infrastructure prevented some residents from receiving timely information. Monterrey, an industrial city that is the economic heart of northern Mexico, faced a far greater challenge. On September 8th, the Centenario Dam, located in Tequisquiapan, a central region connected to Monterrey's water system, reached 113% capacity. Water overflowed the dam, triggering mass evacuations in flood-prone areas. The Nuevo León state government declared a state of emergency and activated disaster response protocols. Controlled venting was implemented to prevent structural damage to the dam, but the released water still caused flooding in several districts. Thousands of residents were moved to temporary shelters, and clean water supplies were disrupted for more than 48 hours. Monterrey, known for its modern drainage system, proved unable to withstand the sudden influx of water. Major roads turned into rivers, and vehicles became trapped in knee-deep floodwaters. Several hospitals reported a surge in patients with minor injuries, hypothermia, and respiratory problems. Guadalajara, Mexico's cultural capital in the state of Jalisco, was not spared the storm's impact. Tropical waves 9 and 10, interacting with the annual rainy season, brought extremely heavy rainfall, with intensities ranging from 50 to 75 millimeters. The accompanying winds reached speeds of 80 kilometers per hour, enough to uproot ancient trees and damage roofs. Some suburbs experienced localized flooding and minor landslides. Schools and offices were disrupted, and the city government issued an advisory for residents to stay home. Although no casualties were reported, infrastructure damage was significant, particularly to the power grid and public transportation. Guadalajara, previously considered better prepared for the rainy season, demonstrated that climate change and the intensification of extreme weather events have exceeded the city's adaptive capacity. Early warning systems were effective, but public response was limited by uncertainty and a lack of disaster education. This extreme weather event was triggered by a complex interaction between tropical waves number 9 and number 10, low pressure in the Gulf of California and the Pacific Ocean, and high sea surface temperatures. These conditions amplified atmospheric convection and produced heavy rain and strong winds in northern and central Mexico. Mexico's rainy season, which typically lasts from May to October, showed higher than average intensity this year. Meteorologists noted that sea surface temperatures in the eastern Pacific increased by 1.2 degrees Celsius compared to the previous year, increasing the formation of tropical clouds and storms. Systemically, rapid urbanization in Monterrey and Guadalajara has increased the risk of flooding. Development that does not pay attention to spatial planning and land conservation has reduced water catchment areas. Suboptimal drainage systems, especially in rural areas, exacerbate flooding and slow the recovery process. Piedras Negras, although smaller in population, exhibits similar vulnerabilities. The city lies in the transition zone between semi-arid and tropical climates, so changing weather patterns significantly impact environmental and social stability. This disaster not only impacted infrastructure but also the psychological and social dynamics of the community. In Monterrey, many residents were temporarily displaced and had to rely on government assistance. In Guadalajara, fear of landslides led some residents to sleep outside. In Piedras Negras, the trauma of thunderstorms and hailstones lingered, especially among children. Local and national media highlighted the disparity in the government's response. Some regions received aid quickly, while remote areas had to wait for days. This disparity sparked public discussion about climate justice and the need for disaster policy reform. Civil society organizations mobilized, providing food, clothing, and psychological support to victims. Solidarity among residents increased, but logistical and coordination challenges remained major obstacles. The Mexican government, through the National Civil Protection Agency, activated its early warning system and dispatched rapid response teams to the affected areas. Evacuation sites were set up in schools and community centers, and logistical aid began to be distributed. However, disaster experts emphasized that short-term responses were insufficient. Significant investment in disaster-resilient infrastructure, public education, and community-based warning systems is needed. Local governments are also encouraged to update risk maps and strengthen interagency coordination. Residents are advised to avoid traveling at night, prepare emergency supplies, and monitor official government information. Active community participation in disaster simulations and disaster training is key to building long-term resilience. The hydrometeorological disasters that struck Mexico were more than just a series of storms and floods. They were a complex narrative of how nature, humans, and social systems interact in a vortex of crisis. Piedras Negras, Monterrey, and Guadalajara each became the stage for an extreme weather drama that tested the limits of community preparedness, solidarity, and resilience. In Piedras Negras, thunderstorms and hail exposed the fragility of the infrastructure of a small town located in a climate transition zone. In Monterrey, overflowing dams symbolized a water system no longer able to withstand natural pressures and reflected urbanization that has exceeded ecological capacity. Meanwhile, in Guadalajara, strong winds and torrential rains demonstrated that even cities considered prepared can falter when weather intensity exceeds predictions. However, this disaster was not just about physical damage. It touched the deepest layers of social life: fear, loss, and hope. Displaced residents, traumatized children, and communities rallying together demonstrated that amidst the destruction, there is a collective strength that cannot be underestimated. Solidarity among citizens, civil movements, and policy reflections are bright spots amidst the darkness of the angry sky. Systemically, this event confirms that climate change is no longer a future threat. It is present, real, and demands a response that goes beyond mere reactivity. Mexican cities must transform not only their infrastructure, but also their way of thinking and planning for the future. Disaster education, risk-based spatial planning, and inclusive early warning systems must be priorities. Government, academia, and civil society need to work together to build a resilience ecosystem that not only survives but also learns and thrives from each crisis. Furthermore, this narrative also invites philosophical reflection. How do we define our relationship with nature? Are we merely surviving, or can we reconcile and live in harmony with the Earth's rhythms? The storm that struck was not only a warning, but also an invitation to change, individually, collectively, and in policy terms.
Con cuidado.
In conclusion, this disaster is a profound lesson written by nature and read by humans. It teaches that resilience is not a matter of strength, but of togetherness, awareness, and the courage to change. From puddles on the streets to tears in evacuation centers, from lightning strikes to the voices of people supporting each other, all are part of one story. The story of people learning from the storm and choosing to rise up wiser.